So we're on Daf Mem Amid Beis, and I think we finished the Mishnah, and we're up to the Gemara. So you may recall that we had two discussions yesterday, two halachic discussions, and now we're going to discuss the overlap of the two. One discussion was provos chalutzaso, and that's an Issa D'Rabbanan that after a man gives chalitza to the Yevamot, he's not allowed to marry her mother, her sister, her daughter. And we're viewing the Zika as if he was married to her. That's one category, and that's the Rabbanan. Now we have another category, which is called Shnios Larayas. So let's say, for example, on a Doraisa level, a man is not allowed to marry his wife. He's not allowed to marry his wife's mother. He cannot marry his wife's grandmother, but he can marry his wife's great-grandmother. I guess she's still a spring chicken. I don't know. And that's called Shnios Larayas. The Rabbanan took it all the generations, up and down. So now what happens if we have an overlap of Krovas Chalutzaso, but it would be a relative that is only Shnios Larayas, Iboilahu, Gazru, Shnios Bechalutza. So we have A plus B. We have Shnios and Chalutza. O, Lo, we will not superimpose, I call it the piggyback, the Gzeras Shnios on top of the Gzera of Chalutza, of Krovas Chalutzas. Meaning, according to this, I think now the Gemara is explaining the second side. Lo, the erva doraisa. So let's say, for example, a man gives chalitza, and now let's say he wants to marry her mother. Or her grandma. Is Gazu Be'Rabbanan. Just 1 second. The Ervido Raisa Gazuhu Rabbanan. Right, so let's say, for example, a man is not allowed to marry the mother of his wife, his shviga, his mother-in-law. But what about his wife's grandma? So that's already Shnios Larayos. So we started with an Ervidoraisa of Chamoso, and we extended it through the Gzera of Shnios Larayos to Aim Chamosa, his wife's grandma. But we started with the Doraisa. But Bechalutza lo Gazra Rabbanan Shnios. When we start with Chalutza, which means the Krovos, the relatives of his Chalutza, now you're talking about a D'Rabbanan. We don't add Shnios. Bechalutza lo Gazra Rabbanan Shnios. That's one side in the suffix, in the boiler. It's the last side, so he's going backwards. Bechaluta lo gazru rabbanon shnios. So again, in a minute, we're going to flesh this out, with different scenarios and relatives and so forth. Oh, Dimalo Shna. Or should we say, no, once the Chachamim said that you're not allowed to marry the krovos of your chalutza, then we consider your chalutza as if she was your wife, and therefore all the arayos that apply to your wife, even shnios, will apply to chalutza as well, because chalutza is ke'ishto. And once again, I'm looking high and low, but I haven't seen it. I haven't found it yet. Why we don't see someone saying that there's xero. Anyway, Toshma. Now, the word who is synonymous with the word choletz. Who asur be'ima ube'em ima. So when a man gets married, not only is he prohibited from marrying her mother, his mother-in-law, but even her grandmother, which is called aim ima. And that's dorais. That's an erev dorais. But ve'ilu aim ima. Now we get to the great grandmother, lo ketana. Why did the Mishnah only mention ima ve'aim ima? Her mother, his mother-in-law, or his grandmother-in-law, her grandma, but it did not mention her great-grandma. So this is great news for great-grandmothers, because we're expanding their marriage possibilities of a great-grandmother. We have to have a society, right? Great-grandmothers matter. That's a new society. So we're going to allow a man to marry his chalutza's great-grandmother. He cannot marry his wife's great-grandmother because of the Xera of Shniyas Larayas. But as far as his chalutza's great-grandmother, we're being medayik from the Mishnah, he's allowed to marry his chalutza's great-grandmother. So imagine, let's say Ruvain is married to Rachel, and Shimon is married to Rivka. Shimon is not allowed to marry Rivka's great-grandmother. That's called shnios. Now, when Ruvain dies and Rachel falls b'yibum to Shimon, Shimon gives a chalitza, can he marry Rachel's great-grandmother? And the Gemara wants to be medayik from our Mishnah that since the Mishnah only prohibited explicitly her, meaning the chalutza's grandmother, it means by implication that he's allowed to marry the chalutza's great-grandmother, because you're combining and piggybacking two Rabbanan, the Rabbanan of chalutza, meaning Krovos chalutza, together with Shnios Arayas, a great-grandmother. But unfortunately, the Gemara rejects this. For Dilma, I'm going to play the devil's advocate. Maybe we will pile up one Xera on top of the other, and Krovas Chalutzaso generates an Easter of Shnios Larayos. But you'll ask me, so why did the Mishnah stop at grandmother, not go a step further for great-grandmother to tell me that Chiddush? Ainu time elotani mishum de kaboilim stay safer ve'achim mutarim. Now we have to work hard. Till that was easy. Now, we assumed until now that Reuven died and he left Shimon, a single brother. But now we're going to talk about Levi. When Shimon gives Rachel, the almana of his brother Reuven, chalitza, Shimon now becomes enjoined from marrying Rachel's relatives, Krovas Chalutzoso. But Levi is allowed to marry Krovas Chalutzas Shimon. Levi didn't give Chalitza to Rachel, Ashes Reuben. And therefore, although Levi's not allowed to marry Rachel, but he can marry Rachel's daughter, mother, sister, and that's called ha'achim mutar. Okay, fine. What does that have to do with us? If the Mishnah would have said, ima, that as far as Shimon the Cholitz is concerned, he's not allowed to marry Rachel's great-grandmother, which is true. He's not allowed, according to this Tzad Gemara, he's not allowed to marry Rachel's great-grandmother. Hava, I would have said that achim mutarim dafka be'em ima. You'd be very confused here, because in contrasting Levi with Shimon, you would think that the contrast applies only with regard to the shnios. Do you follow what I mean? So that gzera in which we piggyback shnios on top of krovas chalutzaso, that only applies to the acha choletz. But the basic iser of krovos, which means an erev doraisa, for example, her grandmother, that would apply even to Shimon, even to Levi.
Do we say, is this because perhaps that is there a lower level of Zika amongst the other brothers than the?
No, I don't think it's that, Reuven. I think what we're saying is that the Torah prohibited chalutza. It's a separate din in chalutza. We're not talking about the Zika. That the chalitza itself generates certain arayos. It's almost as if yibum and chalitza become one. And we're saying that the chalitza is a quasi-yibum. Again, that sounds very antithetical because, chalitza is just the opposite of yibum. But we're saying that the chalitza is the culmination of the culmination of the zikas yibum. It is the full-fledged zikas yibum that makes it almost like ishto. That's the chalitza. And again, you might argue, well, any one of the brothers theoretically could have given chalitza, but it's irrelevant. Whichever brother steps up to the plate and implements chalitza, then we have this concept of krovas chalutzas, because the chalutza is like ishta. Avol be'em ima ube'ima lo. But as far as the other achim, vis-a-vis an erev doraisa, like for example, Rachel's mother, Rachel's grandmother, that would be an Isur even with regard to Levi, the other brother. That's how we would have read the Mishnah. I'll read to you his commentary. Ya'inu omrim shehu cholatz b'shlichusa. Now we would, and this is very similar to what Reuven was saying, that, but a slightly different perspective. Not Zikas Yibum, but the Maisa Chalitza would be related to Levi as well through Shlichus, meaning Shimon stepped up to the plate, but he was in effect representing the other brothers, because again, the Chiyuv Chalitza is incumbent upon other brothers. Again, that takes us back to the Halacha B'chor and a Gadol Shabbat, but in theory, let's say they're all equal, all men were created equal here in terms of the brothers and chalitza. So the one brother that was choletz is a shliach of the other brothers. The relatives of the chalutza are prohibited on the choletz. Kamochein hein osros asuros l'kol ha'acher. Again, not on the same level, but on a level of shlichus. V'lachein And how far would we extend that? So now we have the Mishnah that says Ha'achim Mutarim. We're going to say Ha'achim Mutarim is a reference to the great grandmother, to the Shnios Larayos. V'lachein lo shana hatana isur bi'em em ima kidei shelo niteh. But we shouldn't make any mistakes. It could very well be that had the Mishnah not been concerned with the Seifa of Ha'achim Mutarim, if we only had independently the Reisha, the Mishnah would have added Aim, Ima. Because Einochinami, even Shnios Larayos, would combine with Krovas Chalutzos. So at this point, we're left with a stalemate. We had a kasha and a raya, and then we rejected it. We're still basically in the dark. So the Gemara asks the following. It's not always so smooth to say that the Mishnah didn't say what it really wanted to say, because in the Seifa, you would come to some mistaken reading of the Seifa. Sometimes the Gemara feels that that's a very weak argument. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was the expert in the literature, the formulation of the Mishnah. He could have found a way of avoiding this kind of misunderstanding in a very simple way. He could have just said, Aim, Ima, in the Reisha, when we're talking about the brother who's the Choletz. He could have said Aim, Ima. You're telling me that then we'd make a mistake that the Seifa and the Achim Mutarim, listening to Achim Mutarim B'Kulon. And the word B'Kulon is all that Rebbe needs to add in order to clarify this mess up, this mistake, this issue. If he would have added the word B'Kulon, it would refer not only to Aim, Ima, but even to Aim, Ima, and even to Aim, Ima, meaning it would refer to all across the board, from the Shnios Larayos all the way down to the Arayos Mamash and Mutta B'Kulon. So why didn't Rebbe, he was a pretty brilliant writer, why didn't he think of this solution? And had he done so, then he would have avoided all the problems, and he would have written, in the case of the Reisha, meaning regarding the Choletz, Aim, Ima. That's what he should have written. And for the fact that he didn't write it, and he omitted it, it's proof positive that there's no Iser on the Choletz vis-a-vis Aim, Ima, the great-grandma. The Gemara says kasha, which sounds like the Gemara accepts this logic and therefore concludes that there's a raya in favor of that view that maintains that there's no piggyback, there's no adding Shnios Larayos, Aim, Imo to the Iser of Chalutza, of Krovas Chalutza. But you know what? That's as far as the Mishnah is concerned. And the inclination of the Gemara as far as reading the Mishnah is that there's no Iser of Shnios Larayos in the case of Krovas Chalutza. But maybe we'll find some Brisa that's more explicit and addresses this issue of Shnios Larayos in Krovas Chalutza. So Toshma. He asura bi aviv u'ba'avi aviv. This is still the Mishnah. We haven't gotten to the Brisa yet. He asura bi aviv u'ba'avi aviv. Since we're viewing B'Rabbanan, of course, Chalutza as Ishto, then now we can flip it around to the other side of the coin. She's not allowed to marry his relatives, which means she cannot marry her husband's father. Again, in this case, not a husband, it's a Yevamot, but she cannot marry his father nor his grandfather. But wait a second, what about his great-grandfather? Before we had the great-grandmother matters company. Now we have the great-grandfather's company. Which reminds me that my grandson just turned 18. So you never know. In the yeshivas, especially the old city where he studies, they get married very young. I mean, if he asked me, I would tell him to wait a few years, but he's not going to ask that, I promise. Ktani mia avi aviv umay lav mishum choletz. So we're talking about the grandfather of the choletz vis-a-vis the chalutza, Davile kalas bino. One second. I thought the Gemara was just going to say straight from. What about avia of it? What's he saying? Kalas bino. Right, so the grandfather is Kalas, the grandfather vis-a-vis Rachel, we called her, means that she is the Kala of his son. Let's just get that straight. Now, what happens now? Shimon gives Rachel Chalitza. So Shimon's father, vis-a-vis Rachel, Rachel's status is Kalos. That's Shimon's father. Aviv. Again, as far as Shimon's father is concerned, she is what? She is Kalas Bino. Right? Because Reuven was married to Rachel. So the common father of both Reuven and Shimon, we call him Yaakov, is Rachel's Kalas Bino Reuven. Okay, fine. So what's the Gemara's point over here? Kevan sha'afim niseis lo neseres le'avi aviv elamidin shnios dirabanan in Kevan shasru lachalutza uchashagoz shnios. So now I think we're going back down one generation above to Yitzchak, right? So Yaakov, vis-a-vis Rachel, is a relationship of a father-in-law to a daughter-in-law. But now it says in the Mishnah, Avi Aviv, which is Yitzchak. So that's called Shnios Larayos. What is that? Shnios Larayos. The grandfather is Shnios Larayos. Let me just work that out of my mind. Shnios Larayos, since he can't marry a husband's father, but a husband's grandfather is only a Shnios Larayos. Before we said that it had to be a great grandmother. Now it's something how late. You don't have footnotes, do you? Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone has an art scroll on Chagiga that I could borrow? Keep me in mind. Anyway, so what happened over here? We're talking about we're talking about a grandfather-in-law. A grandfather-in-law. Does he say anything about a grandfather-in-law as to why that's only Shnius Larayo?
Oh. I was just saying that
I'm mixing
the
a piece.
Rayos are his sons or daughters, daughter-in-law. So
again, Yaakov vis-a-vis Rachel is his son's daughter-in-law, right?
Right.
Now let's go back one generation to Yitzchak. I'm trying to figure out if Yitzchak would be allowed to marry Rachel on a Doraisa level. That's what I want to know, because we said before that that Ema Imo is Doraisa and the Shnios was Ema Imo. But here it's only Avi Avi.
Yeah. Daughter-in-law.
His son's daughter-in-law is Yaakov vis-a-vis Rachel, correct?
Right.
Okay, so that's certainly Doraisa.
Right.
Now, what about Yitzchak vis-a-vis Rachel? That's his grandson's.
So it's his son's daughter-in-law, which is his grandson's wife, is Shnia Sarai.
So does he explain that? Why is that so? Because I'm missing one generation. Why is that called Shnia Sarai?
It just says that it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it said that a man is not allowed to marry his wife's grandma on a Doraisa level. And his wife's great grandmother is Shniel Sarai.
Right.
Now, if on the flip side, it should be that she can't marry her husband's grandfather.
Uh-huh.
No? And there's some lack of symmetry, which I thought they would explain.
They do.
Oh, they do? Can you read it out loud, Don?
Unless I'm missing what you're saying, that there's note 17.
Note 17.
And it says, Reuben died and Shimon performed chalitza. Since we treat the chalutza as Shimon's wife, she may not marry Shimon's grandfather since she is the equivalent of his grandson's wife, which is, I read the wrong one. Wait a minute. No, I missed it. There was one where she said because she's forbidden to marry her husband's grandfather.
Oh.
So when her
Is that
husband
Doraisa or
now the brother, his grandfather's the same grandfather, so she's forbidden to marry him as well.
So where do we introduce Shnios? I mean, I thought the whole point is that there's an Isur Shnios here and Avi Ovid, but that's not Shnios. Why is that called Shnios?
Yeah, they don't say that.
Let's just see. Maybe the Gemara is going to raise our objection. I don't know. That's not going to make me totally happy because I want to understand what the Gemara was thinking. But let's see. Lo. Mishum misna. Tahavile kalas b'no. Okay, let's see what the word misna means. Misna means the deceased, I think. Correct? How do you translate? Just translation, the word misna means deceased.
Deceased.
Deceased. Okay, good. So I just want to make sure that I have the tight, So the word misana means deceased. Tahavile kalas bino. Gee. I'm assuming that Misna here is a reference to the person we call Reuven, no? The original brother that died, and Rachel was Reuven's wife. So Reuven is the husband of Rachel, and she's not allowed to marry his father because of the erva of Kal. Anything in your notes here? Because Kalas Benoshe, and it says Machmashnius Galutz El Machmas Bailo Hames, Shahoisa Nesualo, He Shnios Benesu, in Raya, Im Gozu Shnios. So he's saying, he's not questioning, like I was hoping he would, the premise that we're dealing with Shnios. He's accepting that we're dealing with Shnios, the case of Avi Aviv. He's just pointing out that the issue here of Shnios is not an issue of Chalutzaso, but rather a direct issue of Shnios, because the relatives, or shall I say the earlier paternal generations of Reuven are the same as the early paternal relationships of Shimon, meaning Rachel, if she falls for Yibam to Shimon, then the relatives here are not because of Chalitza, has nothing to do with Chalitza. Forget about Chalitza. Chalitza is not relevant here. These relatives, these paternal fathers and grandfathers of Reuven are her husband's grandfathers. You know what I mean? Fathers and grandfathers. So it has nothing to do with Shnios and Chalutza. Forget about Chalutza. It happens to be the same people. All right, so that's where we'll stop. But I'm still missing one generation here in the I have one generation to get to Shnios over here that I didn't figure out yet. I hope maybe by tomorrow we'll figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear in the note here, because it says, since she was actually married to Reuven, she cannot marry Shimon's grandfathers.